Okay, this is going to be a little different than the last two talks. What we actually did a study earlier this year, jointly with Q Control and our friends there. What we were trying to do is actually take a look at financial services. So that means banking, insurance, and trading, and basically try to understand what kinds of use cases would quantum computing potentially be used for in the future. What are the characteristics, the algorithms, and other things that would be required? How do we compare to the best of what can be done classically? And just thinking a little bit about what it would take to actually displace a lot of the classical algorithms that exist. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. I'll try to be concise since we're quite behind. But first, let me tell you a little bit about me and Deloitte. So I'm Scott Buchholz. I lead Deloitte's quantum computing practice. We've been active in quantum computing research. So we have people who put fingers on keyboard and work with the products of a lot of the hardware and software vendors. But Deloitte, I sometimes find, is helpful to orient people in some of these conferences. We're actually the world's largest professional services firm. We have a lot of people in a lot of places, and we do a lot of different things, primarily for the global Fortune 5000, but others as well. Our specialty being basically all things advice, implementation, and so forth. Okay. And I pushed the wrong button. So the first question might be, why did we look at financial services? There are a variety of other industries. It turns out that there's some useful characteristics of financial services, or at least useful characteristics of quantum in financial services. Whether or not it's the fact that there are very complex optimization problems, and some of them start out trivial but get complex very quickly. Whether it's high-dimensional data. I think probably people here understand this. Whether or not it's the need for speed or accuracy or other things, there's a lot that goes on in financial services. The other nice thing about financial services is that improvements can be measured in money. And it turns out that people are willing to spend money to make more money. And so that's a very convenient characteristic when you're thinking about adoption, because if you can save somebody money, they're generally more interested in thinking about it than if it's just a theoretical improvement or a nice to have. What we actually did was I'll sort of take a page from our analysis. And by the way, it's about 25 pages report. You'll get the link to it at the end of this. You can go read it in all its glory and detail if you're curious. But a lot of what we did was we had what we call a weighted sum ranking. So we had this variety of 10 factors that we looked at across every use case and every industry. And in fact, we started with, don't quote me on the number, I think it was 54 different use cases. We tried to consolidate that down to a list of somewhere around 16. The goal of that exercise is there was some commonality. Different industries use similar techniques for different things. We then said, okay, for instance, what is the impacted dollar size of the industry? What is the estimated improvement impact based on what we know today of the state of the art in terms of algorithms relative to the state of the art in terms of what's possible classically? We went through all of this, and then we basically applied a process saying which of these seem to be the most important and which of these seem to be less important. Added it all up, did a weighted ranking, and pulled the top 6. Since I know that a lot of people in this audience love to quibble, let me tell you, we also did a sensitivity analysis. We went through and played around with a lot of the weighting parameters. The top 6 are basically the top 6. The order sometimes changes. It's less important. But knowing that these are the things that financial services really cares about is actually the spirit of what you should take away from this. So I'm going to talk about the top 6, 3 at a time. The first one, I think, is sort of generally well known. It's this idea of derivative pricing. And what's important to note is that trading firms and financial services organizations have managed to construct incredibly elaborate sort of systems that they then try to value. And so collateralized debt obligations. There are all sorts of things where the value of the thing is actually dependent on a million other things. And it turns out that some of these options and some of these exotic derivatives are so complex it can actually take almost a day to figure out what is the current value of a particular instance. And if you're a financial services company and you're doing trading, time is money, because if you can calculate that value in 23 hours and your competitors can calculate it in 25, then you have 2 hours to try to convince them that they should give you something for it. And so that's, if you think about it and sort of scrape the surface, that's a lot of what people are trying to get at there. That tends to involve very complex Monte Carlo analysis. So running lots of simulations over time to try to figure out what's the most likely answer in the range of answers. That's really what's going on there. And so that is actually one of the sort of well-known, well-studied, and incredibly complex use cases that people have been looking at. Liquidity optimization is a different problem. It's more of an optimization problem. It's basically the idea that, let's pretend, for instance, that we're the Federal Reserve. For those who may not be aware, basically, I think it's all the electronic funds transfer transactions that get done every day in the US go through the Federal Reserve. It turns out that if you sequence those transactions correctly, you can minimize or maximize the amount of cash on hand that's required by any particular financial institution throughout the day. And that's actually important because it controls the amount of liquidity that banks have. It affects a lot of other things. And then therefore, it turns out that transaction optimization in transaction flow is not only an incredibly important optimization problem, it's actually an incredibly complex one. I'm trying to remember the number of possibilities, of ordering possibilities when you sort of get a handful of transactions, but it gets really big really fast. Google earlier today was talking about 10 septillion. You can get somewhere in that range if you really want to pretty quickly. All you have to do is string a couple hundred transactions together. So that's an important problem. By the way, nobody goes through septillion transactions. There are lots of different ways to solve the problem, or to simplify the problem, but that's actually a really important problem in financial services. Portfolio optimization. Lots of people have been talking about portfolio optimization. It turns out that there are portfolio optimization problems that are actually pretty trivial, that are actually have well-known classical solutions. If you just want a straightforward S&P portfolio that potentially maximizes return and minimizes risk, that's actually a pretty straightforward calculation. Nobody's really impressed by that. It turns out, though, that if you start adding more exotic products that have different performance characteristics, if you start placing constraints, you start adding in fees, transaction fees, your periodicity, so we need to update this value every couple of days or hours or months or what have you, your problem can get complex very, very quickly. And so being able to come up with a better answer becomes really important. Now, what's also true is sometimes periodicity, if you think about it for a moment, becomes an important factor. If you're only doing this once a month and it takes you a day, you may not care, right? Because you only have to do it every once in a while. However, if you have to do it more frequently, if it is more time sensitive because values are fluctuating rapidly, if you are trying to get a more optimal solution more quickly, then that's where you start getting into the interesting use cases. And I'm just trying to give you some examples of why quantum might be more interesting as opposed to just the best we can do classically today. Risk analysis. So this is the counterparty credit risk, value at risk. These are, to sort of go through this, these are sort of things in financial services that you can think about where value at risk is, if you're a financial institution, you basically need to be able to report, are you going to go bankrupt? That's essentially what your regulators want to know. Do you have enough cash on hand or saleable assets on hand that you know what's going on. The value at risk, and this occurs in insurance and other industries as well, is basically trying to make sure that you can estimate how much liquidity do you need given the portfolio and the complexity of the things that you have on hand. And this is basically to try to avoid runs on banks and other sorts of things. So it becomes a really important set of problems, complex set of calculations, potentially improved by quantum, sort of TBD. The last two things here, I will just say, is supervised anomaly detection and unsupervised anomaly detection. So anomaly detection is the fancy word for fraud detection. Although not all anomalies are fraud, sometimes you want to just look for interesting things. Interesting transactions in a pattern of trading transactions might tell you that something weird is going on. So it's not always fraud, but it's often fraud in financial services. Supervised anomaly detection is when you start with a set of data where you know which ones are fraudulent or not, or which ones are anomalous or not. And you're basically saying to the machine, somewhere in here, there are signs that we should look for that cause us to want to flag these things and not those things. Being able to do a better job of picking these things from those things is really important. There's also a timing problem. Being able to do that timely on a recurring basis for some problems is important. There are other cases where timeliness is not as important. Where might timeliness not be as important? If you think about insurance fraud, the volume of transactions is lower. The processing time that you have to deal with an individual transaction is higher. Credit card fraud, on the other hand, detection is a different animal. There are many more credit card transactions. They need to be approved, in fractions of a second. It's really a different kind of problem. What's interesting is, as we've been going around and talking about some of this, we say, well, insurance, by the way, obviously has a fraud problem. And we went and talked with some property and casualty insurers, and they actually said, we believe fraud is a solved problem in our industry. We don't really worry. It's nice that you have a better fraud detection engine, but we don't really care because we don't think we have that problem. We think we've got some other problems over here we'd love to talk to you about, but it's not always the case that the fact that fraud exists means that an organization believes they need a better solution to that problem. And so this actually gets really interesting and nuanced when you get into it, and thinking about what sorts of problems are interesting to look at is sort of a fun and interesting problem. And then last, but certainly not least, is the idea of unsupervised anomaly detection. And this one, you throw a bunch of data at the machine, and you basically tell it, find me some interesting correlations that we should pay some attention to. That is a dramatic oversimplification of how it works for all those who actually know how it works in here. The interesting thing being that there's some evidence that it may actually be more straightforward to do unsupervised machine learning in a quantum realm than it is classically. Classically, this is an incredibly finicky, painful, annoying problem. We have some data scientists on the team who used to work for banks, and they love to complain about how hard it was. And they are very excited about how much easier they think it might be with quantum computing. And so if you want to know what's the sort of classical example of this is from, it was actually 30 years ago from data, we used to talk about data mining. This is a little bit of unsupervised machine learning. 30 or 40 years ago, somebody discovered when they were looking through the sales data for grocery stores that the best way to sell beer was to put it next to diapers on Friday afternoon. So it took them a while to figure that one out. It turns out that at the time, this was a long time ago, husbands would be headed home. They might, or fathers might be headed home. They might get a call from their wives. Hey, please don't forget to stop by the store and pick up diapers. Walking by the diapers, hey, there's beer. Turns out that unsupervised machine learning can turn up some really interesting stuff. Sometimes it's garbage. Sometimes it makes for entertaining stories. So with that, what I'll say is If you'd like to learn more, you're always welcome to reach out to me. You're welcome to go online and download our report. Questions, comments, thoughts, concerns are always appreciated. And we'd be happy to share more if you have particular questions about details. We are always happy to work with those who are in and around financial services and other industries. If you have questions about how to proceed with quantum in your organizations, we're really focused on trying to figure out how do we get the solutions that we're all working on into the hands of our clients and into their production workflows. Recognizing that we're not there today, but that's where we try to figure out, how are we going to manage all of that in the not too distant future. So thank you all for your time and attention, and I look forward to answering any questions later. So thank you.